What's the craziest military tactic used in history that you can remember? Hannibal marching goddamn war elephants over the Alps. First Punic War. Rome was great at land battles but terrible at naval battles. So they put portable bridges, corvus, on their ships so they could board Carthaginian ships and turn a sea battle into a land battle. The Ghost Army of World War II comes to mind. Hundreds of civilian prop designers and artists recruited to build fake military equipment and inflatable tanks. Dummy paratroopers dropped from planes, all in an attempt to fake massive buildups of units in multiple areas to obfuscate where the Allies really were going to invade continental Europe. And it worked. Among the many crazy ones I have heard of, 1800s British infantry commanders ordering their men to remove the flints from their flintlock before a charge, so they wouldn't stop to shoot and thus destroy the momentum of the assault. The WW2 British using a nighttime air raid to cover for a battleship naval bombardment. The planes showed up. The Germans turned on all their searchlights and looked skywards. And the battleship was able to make its bombardment basically unnoticed, because the Germans thought the explosions were bombs falling. A Welsh woman got every woman in her village to dress in their traditional Welsh costumes and march up and down, carrying pitchforks. From a distance they were mistaken for soldiers and averted an invasion by the French. https en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Battlofishguard. The USS Texas. The USS Texas, along with the British cruiser Glasgow, arrived in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and entered the Omaha Beach Western Fire Support Lane as part of the 702-ship U.S.-British flotilla. It fired 255 shells in 34 minutes, an average of 7.5 shells per minute, or 1 shell every 8 seconds for 34 minutes. The ship's longest sustained firing period in World War II. The ship then targeted farther inland and continued hammering German positions for the next 2 days. But that's not the crazy part. After a trip back to England, the USS Texas returned on June 15, 1944, to support the move inland. But because the Allied forces had already advanced beyond its range, the battleship's guns couldn't aim high enough to reach their intended target. The USS Texas continued to receive requests for fire missions. So the crew decided on an off-the-wall strategy to stay in the game. Since they couldn't raise the port side guns any higher, they lowered the starboard side. They lowered it by intentionally flooding the starboard side of the ship. The crew flooded the ship's torpedo blister, dropping the ship slightly deeper into the water. Between the flooding and the recoil from the guns, the Texas ran the real risk of capsizing. But the gamble worked. The crew was able to get the extra 2 degrees needed to fire the guns accurately and give them the range they needed to hit their targets. The empty fort strategy during the Chinese Three Kingdoms era was pretty bonkers. You threw open your castle gates, removed visible defenses and sat there. The enemy would be too scared to attack in case of an ambush. Since it was only a few years ago that Cao Cao used the strategy and won against Lu Bu's superior forces, then there's at least one commander who even went to the next level and faked the empty fort strategy. Wen Ping of Wei had few soldiers and a damaged fortress against thousands of Wu attackers. So he simply pretended to be pretending to weak and did the same strategy. The enemy withdrew, and Wen Ping attacked with his available forces. Because the Wu commander believed they were being ambushed, they kept retreating and got routed by a vastly inferior force. Edit. Seems some people think it's part of the romance of the Three Kingdoms fiction written in the 14th century. It's not. The original text is from the Viaway around the 3rd century. The historical record has been lost to time, but parts of it are quoted in other texts such as the History of Tang compiled in the 11th century. Don't know if it was ever actually used or which war specifically, but Canadian soldiers tossing canned food into enemy territory to lull them into a false sense of trust, and then later the Canadian soldiers would throw grenades so the enemy soldiers would run over thinking it was food. But no, it was explosions. I'd have to say that's bordering on psychological warfare. In Stalingrad, Chuikov's preferred tactic was to hug the enemy. He told his soldiers to keep the German soldiers within a grenade's throw of themselves so they couldn't use artillery. WW2. Dead guy disguised as British military officer strategically dumped with fake papers indicating a false battle plan. Germany buys it. Allied win. There was that time Roman Emperor Caligula ordered his army to attack the ocean. He declared war on Neptune, the god of the sea, during a failing military campaign against the ancient occupants of Britain. His army went to the beach and stabbed the ocean, and he ordered his men to collect the seashells as spoils of war, and as payment for being such good boys. The British sending a destroyer packed with explosives and full of commandos, disguised as a German destroyer, up the Loire Valley to crash it into the dry dock gates. The commandos jumping off and blowing up all the dock pumps and winding houses. Then setting off the destroyer bomb, complete with inspecting Germans, to prevent Tirpitz from being able to roam the Atlantic without dry dock facilities on the west coast of Europe. https en.wikipedia.org/wiki/Saint-Nazaire. 500 years ago, China destroyed its world-dominating navy because its political elite was afraid of free trade. The charge of Leroy Jenkins. Julius Caesar laid siege to the city of Alesia in Gaul and built a wall around the city to keep its army, commanded by Vercingetorix, inside. Then built another concentric wall around his army to protect it from the Gallic reinforcements that were on the way to lift the siege. Nothing beats the Trojan horse. Learning to play Warhammer with my son, who had been playing for a while in my first game. He felt that sending his strongest character into a direct melee battle with orc boys was a good tactic. Except I'd figured that deploying my guys in small mutually supporting fireteams seemed like a sensible option, and wiped his side out, taking only a few casualties. Since that historic day, he has always used fireteams. No Rambos. The Romans would take pigs, coat them in pitch and tar, point them toward the enemy formation, and set them on fire. The pigs would trample through the formation in a frenzy, breaking it apart. I would like to add the capture of Dutch warship by French cavalry during the Revolution. Extract from Wiki. The capture of the Dutch fleet at Den Helder on the night of the 23rd of January 1795 presents a rare occurrence of an interaction between warships and cavalry, in which a French Revolutionary Hussar regiment came close to a Dutch fleet frozen at anchor in the Nieuwe Diep, just east of the town of Den Helder. After some of the Hussars had approached across the frozen Nieuwe Diep, the French cavalry negotiated that all 14 Dutch warships would remain at anchor. A capture of ships by horsemen is an extremely rare feat in military history. In the War of 1812, Detroit was surrendered without resistance to the British. The British got off their boats and walked right into the fort. The tactic was that while the British had a much smaller force, some sections would break off from the disembarking of the ships and get back on and disembark again. This gave the perception of a massive force was about to burn Detroit to the ground with ease. The commander of Fort Detroit surrendered because of this misconception.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Heracast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.